struggle and shriek near the daybreak, being driven to madness with fright.
So, in the house I grew up in, my bedroom was above the living room area. Quite often we would hear what sounded like someone running across my bedroom. We would hear it numerous times a day, and my parents would sometimes hear it when I was upstairs in the room. However, I never heard it when I was in the room. We heard this running/banging for the whole time we lived there. When I got older and started to think more about it, I discussed it with my mum, and she said that her and my dad had always found it weird. In the last year we lived in the house, we heard it more frequently. So, one day my mum went to our neighbour's house to see if maybe it was coming from there. However, it was deemed impossible, and our neighbours said that they heard it too, and thought I was banging on the wall between my bedroom and their house, which obviously I wasn't. The only weird thing I actually saw when living there was a shadow. There was a streetlight outside my bedroom window, and sometimes I would sleep with the blinds open. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a shadow of a person just go across the wall. It's almost impossible for the shadow of someone from the street to show in my room, since I was on the second floor. I've never been able to explain it. In the last week of us owning the house, I stayed there alone whilst my parents went and stayed at our new house. We were moving further away, and I stayed there to hang out with my friends since it was summertime. In that last week, our house alarm set off every single night at different times, which was very weird. So then I moved to our new house. I was 17 at the time, and on the second day, I went to take a shower. When I got into the shower, I felt a solid hand on my back, and it pushed me forward. I was completely startled. I got right out and went into the dining room where my mum was, and I told her about it. She started laughing and said she had experienced the same thing the night before. We both described the feeling exactly the same. I walk to work and have two routes. One has light with no stops like stores or gas stations, and one has gas stations and stores but has a huge dark patch and gets very spooky, and also has a lot of occurrences like the one I experienced today. I took the dark way because I stopped and grabbed a drink, and it was about 4 a.m. I was a bit into the dark patch when, from my left, a wooded area near a field that's attached distantly to my work, I heard what I thought was dog tags. I didn't look and kept walking, as I knew weird occurrences happen on this road, and I didn't want to spook myself in the dark. It started following me, about 5 feet behind me on the road, but there were no footsteps, only the sound of jingling dog tags. When I would speed up or slow down, so would the thing. The only way to tell was the sound of the dog tags. It followed me until the light of my work started to shine on me, and at that point, it crossed the road and went into the woods. The entire time I had this eerie, off-putting feeling of dread, and this weird smell was surrounding me. But I can't begin to describe it. I felt like if I didn't hurry up and get to work, I wouldn't make it home at the end of the day. That thing was going to do something to me. I just know it.
So my mom would always encounter something paranormal wherever she would be. Her grandmother's house, her house as a kid, her home now. Something would always happen. It could be a full body apparition, or in some cases, half body apparitions. Literally. It could be footsteps, objects moving, etc. I've experienced things too. All of her rooms are upstairs, and we would hear footsteps leave my brother's room and walk into the doorway of mine. Or my mom would hear something like a big dresser falling over, and a bunch of stuff scattering everywhere in my brother's room, or a little bouncy ball bouncing around, and then she would go to see what happened and the room would be normal, as if nothing happened. My mom visited a medium, and the medium told her that she had a follower. It wasn't particularly evil or fully good, but mischievous. It liked to mess around, but then she asked if there was a woman and a little boy in the house too. We would occasionally hear a woman's cry for her baby, and a baby cry or something. The medium told her that the follower basically liked to shapeshift, in our case, from a woman to a baby. It would also like to show itself by peeking around our fridge into our living room, or walk in our backyard with half a body. We have what we like to call a Harry Potter closet under our staircase that is used for storage, and my mom's boyfriend and his boss were over talking about all the crazy stuff that would happen around the house, and that very second, something starts to bang real loudly in the closet that they were standing next to. They opened it, and no one was there. My mom and I think that the ghost didn't like him at all, which was funny because ever since they broke up, paranormal activity wasn't all too common as it was before. One night, my little brother and I shared the same room. My mom woke up to screaming, and my little brother was crying with a pile of hangers on him, and no one else could have done it. Everyone in the house was sleeping, but she knew that the spirit did it, and she was mad. She talked to another medium that told her that the experience made the spirit feel bad, that it was just playing around and realized it crossed the line when it messed with her kid. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed.
So this happened years ago, while I was still in high school. I'm now 23 and have never shared this story anywhere, and only ever with a select few people in person. I live in Missouri, just north of Kansas City. One night, my buddy and I snuck out of my parents' house to go smoke. There was a trail that was right by my house and the local elementary school. Never really seen anything out there outside of deer, foxes, coyotes, etc. But growing up, we heard from parents and other families that the woods nearby were haunted, and I never gave it much thought. The area we lived in was right near an old slave farm. After we snuck out, we made it to the trail. On one side of it, there was the backs of houses. To the other side, woods. As we were walking down the trail, it felt like any other time we had done it. For the first 3/4 of the trail, everything was fine. But as we came to the final bend, my friend slapped my arm and pointed into the woods and asked if I had just saw that. I looked into the woods and saw nothing, so I blew it off and thought he was just out of it. So I kept walking like everything was fine, while he still had his eyes glued to the woods. At the final stretch, about 50 yards, all canopied over, he slapped my arm again and stopped me, this time with force, so I looked over thinking it was still nothing. I saw a figure of something similar to a human shape but standing about 8 foot high. The reason I saw it was since the trees by it were shaking. At this point, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was scared nonetheless. I said we should keep moving, and we did. But now, I too had my eyes glued on whatever it was in the woods. We picked up our pace to a speed walk, and after about 10 steps or so, the thing started to move as well, but on a path that would put it on the trail in front of us before the end. At that point, we looked at each other and immediately started running, like running as fast as we could. We made it to the end of the trail and cut through someone's yard into the street. Once there, I looked back towards the trail and saw that figure standing on the edge of the trail. After that, we went back to mine and talked about what just happened. As a couple of notes, there hasn't been any bear sightings up in my area, but we have had some bobcats and cougars. Not sure what it was. I don't think it was Bigfoot, but if it was human, then it had to be some 8-foot tall guy in the woods behind my neighborhood at 2 a.m. So I've been back and forth on whether or not to tell this story, mostly because it involves some aspects of my working life that I am not at liberty to discuss, but also because it had severe personal implications for me. Anyway, I've decided to share it here, and I hope you understand why there are things I simply can't go into detail about. This all started in December 2020. As part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with this type of patients, so I was really excited about it. I switched around the 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated a lot of different people with lots of different problems. I was curious about all the different aspects, so I never said no to a task, which meant I came across everything from murderers and pedophiles to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw shit at me, and all that stuff. So I like to think I'm a pretty tough guy. And besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button and staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed that there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained. But most patients get the watch pulled off them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague and she told me it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who was extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained to her bed for 3 months. I could not believe what I was hearing. We have really strict procedures when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they are soft belts made of fabric, not leather. So restraining the patient really is the absolutely last resort we go to. I asked the chief psychiatrist what was up with this girl, and he just scoffed and said, if I only knew, but honestly, she defies logic. He told me that, at first, they thought she was just psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse, no matter how much different medication they tried. Then, they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state. But that still didn't fit the profile of her symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That is practically unheard of, especially as no drugs were involved. We regularly make a toxicology check of all patients, and always when they're admitted. One day my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only her legs and torso fixated. Again, normal procedure, if the patient otherwise is relatively calm. She had defecated in her hand and thrown it at the guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4 had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood or the fact that she would throw her own filth at us. I had seen that loads of times. But the screams this woman made, it was the most primal, guttural, and terrifying sounds I've ever heard. It scared me shitless. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling and a mountain lion hissing and spitting at the same time. I've seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could have never imagined that a person could make sounds like that. As an intern, I'm in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her fully to her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Let me remind you, these are really experienced people. At last, we called a medicinal alarm, which immediately calls for a chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her 1 and then a 2nd shot. It only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed enough so that they could restrain her. She never nodded off, she just breathed heavily and kept staring at the same corner of the room, sometimes smoking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back at the ward. It was a relatively calm weekend, so there really wasn't much to do. Anne was in one of her good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I see Anne walking in the hallway without the guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I catched up with her. I asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so. Even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you, but when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. I, for one, always tried to look at the person and not the illness, so I asked her where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to a book cabinet, turned and looked at me, and muttered, "Read book." I was completely taken aback by the fact that she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. She then sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning. But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. Then she cuddled up to me, put her head on my lap and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by and looked absolutely shocked. And before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychiatrist, were looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is always nice. But then, things took a turn for the worse, for me at least. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me, until I heard something from upstairs, coming down the stairs. The best way to describe it is like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you. But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down, while nails or claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up, thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house, but there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living shit out of me. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents. But I also had strange effects on my body, like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to disassociate. I had this feeling of being totally out of contact with my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedics said I had a heart rate of 240 BPM. I have had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figured it was stress. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sit in the top corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days later, I told my girlfriend about it because she kept pestering me with the questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're just about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner and you sort of smirk." That reminded me of Anne. And now, I'm absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I have never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff. And I have never suffered any psychological problems before. Never. But something is going on. I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She is in a rehabilitating home where she thrives. One day she might even be able to have her normal life back.
Many years ago in basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, our unit was doing a land navigation course. The course is designed to make sure soldiers learn how to read a map, and you're tasked to find locations. Once at the location, there is a code that you need to write down, thus proving that you actually found it, and then you make your way back. There's a day course and a night course, both out in the middle of the woods of Kentucky. We set up at the day course site and completed it without incident. However, our drill sergeants, being masters of efficiency and laziness, decided that instead of moving everyone, including themselves, to the location of the night nav course, that they would just make us walk and navigate there on our own. This added about 2 miles in each direction of the course. They did allow us to start our course early, so we could at least get a starting point before dark. We were paired up in teams of 2, so me and my battle buddy planned out our route. One location was in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and the other one was a far distance away, but along a dirt road. Knowing that if we moved quickly, we would still have enough sunlight to work with if we went to the middle of nowhere location first, as it would be the hardest to find, whereas the one along the road next to a cemetery, we figured would be easy to locate without any light. We found the first location without too much difficulty, but the sun was quickly setting and it was becoming twilight. As we made our way back out to the road to the second location, by this time the cemetery was pitch black as the sun had already set. We also only had one flashlight because, in the infinite wisdom of a basic trained soldier, my battle buddy didn't think to bring his flashlight for this night navigation course. We ended up circling around this Civil War era cemetery before we finally found the location marker. We wrote down the code we needed and began a very long walk to the day navigation site. Luckily, it was a straight shot down roads, so we didn't really need to worry about getting lost or trying to get through thick woods at night. However, only about a mile down the road, I began to get this feeling that something was following us. I looked behind us, but saw nothing. The further we walked, the stronger the feeling got, as if it was slowly getting closer and closer to us. I asked my battle buddy if he felt anything, but he just gave me this confused look and began to get very annoyed as I turned around and pointed the flashlight behind us rather than keeping it ahead of us. The feeling of dread kept getting stronger, and I repeated the Lord's Prayer in my head several times, trying to calm myself down or make this thing go away. As the feeling of dread reached a fever peak, it suddenly dissipated and I didn't feel anything behind us anymore. For a split second I was so relieved until it dawned on me that the reason I couldn't feel it behind us anymore was because it was walking right beside us now. It dawned on me that either this was all in my head or my battle buddy is really not sensitive to the paranormal. As the now 3 of us walked for about another mile till we reached our campsite at the land nav course. Once we reached the camp, the feeling had went away and I just relaxed and managed to catch some Z's. Since I never saw anything and it was just a feeling, I would chalk it up to just being a paranoid thought in my head. But the very next day I went to talk to a very good friend of mine in our unit about it. Before I could even tell him my story, he began telling me a series of weird things that started happening in the camp that night. I'll never forget when he said, "Yeah, it all started to happen just after you got back."
About 20 years ago, I lived in an apartment. I would hear knocking on the ceiling quite often. I asked the woman across the hall about it, and she replied, "Oh, that's just a spirit. It stopped once you moved in." A bit after the knocking started, odd things would happen around the apartment. Things would be moved, windows closed, lights turned off. Things that you would say that I just forgot that I had done. Well, one night, I looked out my bedroom and saw the light from my computer on in the other room. I went in and the screensaver was off. When I went back to my bedroom, I laid down on the bed facing the other room to see if it happened again. It wasn't long before I felt something touch my backside. It was a forceful touch. From that time on, I would wake up with 4 scratches on each shoulder at least once a week. I switched bedrooms. The scratches stopped, but every time I was going to see my boyfriend, my keys would come up missing. I would find them in the oddest places, even though I knew that I wouldn't put them in the bathtub, the kitchen cupboards, or my dresser. I brushed it off, like I just misplaced them myself. My boyfriend stayed over one night, and in the morning he asked what I had done to him in the previous evening. He showed me his neck. He had 4 scratches on one side and 1 on the other. It was as if someone grabbed his neck with one hand and scratched him. That was the last time that he came over, and I soon found out that he was not a good person. I moved out of the apartment and into a home with 2 friends. I took the bungalow bedroom. I could hear someone running in the attic every night. It stopped once I put a cross over the door. Odd things started happening. One night we were going to my aunt's home to get my cousin's Ouija board. I distinctively saw someone in our basement when I was the last one to leave. My roommates also would hear someone walking around my bedroom when I wasn't home. A year later I moved into my current home. My cousin moved in with me for a little bit. She would always say that she could hear someone walking up in my bedroom when nobody was home. Nothing much different than the happenings from my apartment happened. Until I met my husband. That's when the traditional haunting things started. Doors closing, things falling, lights flickering, brand new light fixtures breaking. One night when my husband was away and I was working the night shift, I came home to find my back door wide open and the police pulling up. Someone had used a crowbar to remove a window and rob my home. My neighbor saw them taking things from my home and called the police. Had he not called, I would have walked in on them. Almost exactly 1 year later, someone broke into my home again and brutally murdered my husband. Again, I would have been home, but someone stopped me from going home right then. There has been some small things that occurred between the 2 events, and many more since. A car was speeding down the road and driving erratically. It would have hit my home, but it hit a tree and changed its course. 2 dogs were hit by a speeding car in front of my home. The dog that I currently have was hit by a car. Someone attempted to steal my daughter's car, but the alarm went off well after they were in the car. I had a beautiful Doberman that died of cancer when she was only 2 years old. These are just some of the out-of-ordinary events that have happened in the past 5 years. 1 or 2 of these events would be normal, but all of them to the same home in the 5-year span? I am convinced that whatever was in the apartment followed me. However, I do not think that it is malevolent. I think that it is protecting me like it did with my boyfriend. What I am convinced of is that there is something very evil in my home. I say this because I would hear a very odd sound from outside. My dog would also hear it. One night my camera sent me a notification that it captured the sound. It sent chills up my spine that I told my children not to let any of the dogs out. I did investigate the area the next day, and I could not find any signs of animals. I was told by a medium that it sounds like a demon. The same medium told me that the next time the lights flicker, I should tell it that it's my home and it's not wanted. Shortly after this, my daughter and I were cooking dinner. The lights in the kitchen were flickering for about 20 seconds before going out. I figured they were just burnt out. But I laughed and said, "Can you not? This is my home and you don't pay me rent. So until you start paying, you need to leave my stuff alone." I then walked into the dining room and the lights came right back on. I also have a sleep app that records while I sleep. Many times it says that I'm snoring, but it actually sounds like a death rattle. On one occasion I had woken up in the middle of the night and heard it myself. One of the recordings actually has some other sound, and at the very end, that is overlapping the rattle. Another recording had me talking in my sleep, saying that something is heavy. Then you can hear what sounds like footsteps walking away. Recently, my son moved out of the home. I've put my dog's food, water, crate and toys in the room. The past 2 days, my dog refuses to go in there. She used to go in there if he was in there, but now it's to the point that I literally have to take her food out of the room or she will not eat. Back in 2014, when I was a teenager, I was still living in my small hometown in Europe, Bulgaria. Me and my childhood friends, 2 boys and 1 girl, were occasionally taking walks along a highway, which wasn't used that frequently. Most of the time we would see a few trucks pass by, but it wasn't full of traffic, and it was very close to where we lived. So it was just a thing we often did. On the left side of it, there were houses, and on the right, there was a huge empty field with some hills here and there, but most of the land was empty and full of grass. On the right side, where the field was, there was an old abandoned canal, which wasn't used since the early 90s. It was full of trash, sticks, and it was also used to dispose of bones of farm animals such as goats and sheep. But there weren't so many. Creepy, yeah, but we knew they were from animals. We've been there before during the daytime. Nothing impressive really, just an empty hole. One ordinary night, we decided to go on another walk along this highway, and we went to the end of it once, then came back. So we got bored since we're always doing the same thing. Someone had the idea to go along the small dirt road which is alongside the abandoned canal, and we didn't give it much thought. Now bear in mind that on the highway there are streetlights, but on the small dirt road alongside this canal there is no light coming from anywhere. It was a full moon as far as I remember, since it wasn't pitch black, and we could see where we were going without using our phones for light. Anyways, we were walking, joking, laughing and just having some good times really. One of the boys went ahead of us since he was walking faster, whilst me, the other boy and the other girl were behind him, walking a little bit slower. At the middle of the dirt road, the 3 of us decided to go back to the well-lit area on the highway and called the other guy to come back as well. A few minutes passed, and the first boy who was ahead of us was almost at the end of the dirt road when he started running towards us, screaming, "Guys, run!" So instinctively we all turned around to see what was happening, and we just froze. We saw him running very fast towards us, and there was something behind him, following him. Everyone managed to shake out of it and run towards the highway, except me. I stood there for a few more seconds trying to figure out what we were witnessing. It's very hard to describe. It was a figure that was somehow shining bright white light, and it was moving up and down, coming towards us. When I realized I cannot figure out what I was seeing, I turned my back towards it and ran so fast that I even passed the others, even though they started running before me. We didn't stop until we reached the streetlights, and when we did, we turned around. There was nothing behind us anymore. We were terrified at first, but then we just dropped the subject and never spoke of it again. None of us shared this with anybody outside of our childhood group since we thought people would start rumors that we're taking drugs, since it was a very small town. A couple of years go by. We grew up and everyone started moving out to the bigger cities in the area. So at one point, I was the only person from our childhood group left in our hometown, since I was the youngest of us 4. This happened in 2017. I was hanging outside in my hometown with some friends, completely different group of people, who were never close with my childhood friends at any point. We started talking about random stuff. Then it got dark outside and one of the guys suggested that we should share spooky stories. Then, he started talking and shared how recently he and 3 other boys were hanging out during the night along the dirt road next to the abandoned canal. At this point, I was all ears. He then proceeded to describe how exactly the same thing happened to them. How they were just hanging out there, and then some weird figure, shining, bright white thing, came towards them. They got scared, ran away, and then when they looked back at the figure, it had disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My jaw dropped to the ground. Then I shared that a couple of years back, me and 3 other people had experienced the exact same thing, in the very same place, and asked him if any of these people talked with him about this, and if this is some kind of joke, but it wasn't. The story doesn't end exactly here. I went home that night, still stunned, and I barely slept. I kept remembering what happened years ago and trying to figure things out, but thought of nothing that made sense. What we experienced was just unexplainable. So the next day I decided to share everything with my parents and thought that they would brush it off, say that we were just too scared and imagine something. But to my surprise, they were both just staring at me, horrified. I asked them why they were not saying anything and just staring at me. Then they told me how back in the early 90s, when they were teenagers themselves, 2 kids went missing. A 7-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Before they went missing, these kids lived right next door to our apartment, in the house that was facing our balcony. Since it's a small town, everyone thought that the kids would be found soon. But 5 years passed by, and there was no sign of them. Nobody has heard anything. There were no suspects in kidnapping or any leads to what happened to them. Then, on the 5th year of their going missing, the remains were found in the abandoned canal, and by the evidence found there, it was concluded that they had been murdered. The killer was never found. My parents said that this event shook the community back then, and a lot of people avoided going near the canal since this happened. But curious teens were occasionally visiting it and sharing stories of how they have seen something unexplainable. However, nobody ever believed them. To this day, when I visit my hometown and pass the canal, I feel so uneasy and just cannot even think about going alongside the dirt road after knowing what really happened there.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.